Greetings, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Therapist Take, and we're going to talk about the submersible tragedy and how that relates to the role of uncertainty in our life. And so we'll be back talking about that in just a second. Hello, welcome to Therapist Take. We're going to talk about the submersible tragedy, as we know that I think we just learned about it a little over a day ago, maybe less than that, maybe about the final results of that and what happened. Mm-hmm. Of course, we've been following it like everybody else in the world. Yeah, and it just seemed appropriate to talk about today. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're going to talk about, and we don't really have a super structured way of going about talking about this, but that's on purpose too, because I think given how fresh it is and on our minds, on everybody else's mind, that it might just be good just to have some dialogue about it and kind of see if we can take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the complexities of it and things like that.
Right, so. Or kind of exploring why it captured everybody.
Right, yeah, there's a lot of questions. Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting, and that's one of the things that that when you kind of pan out and in these moments of tragedy or pending tragedy, the tone changes around us, right? Like we're not watching as much politics anymore or other types of things, and the whole world is glued to this one thing on what's going to happen. And my assumption is, and given humanity the benefit of the doubt, is everybody's hoping they're going to find these people alive, and we kind of unify in that for a minute,
The world does.
The whole world.
Is unique.
Right. It's a very...
to all be on one side.
But you can feel it, like all of a sudden we're not interested in arguing about stuff anymore. And I'm not saying that isn't happening. There's plenty going on Capitol Hill and stuff during all this too, that there's lots of arguments going on and other things going on in people's lives that don't take a back seat because this happened, but seems like most people were following this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so. I know I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think one of the what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of just start in dialogue and talking about some of the different questions and and just kind of reflect on our experiences with this ourselves, which is all we have, and very even if we have read everything that's out there, which we haven't, it's still very limited data right now on everything to really make a strong assessment on this is what happened and this is who's to blame and there's a lot of strong reliable ideas on what happened, but it's all still very fresh and raw for everybody.
It's still theoretical.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's raw for all of us. I mean, when I didn't learn about this at this point in time. People were just missing. So the day that it happened, when the submersible went missing, went offline, basically. I had a client tell me about it. I didn't even know, and this particular person asked me, like, do you it said something to the effect of, can you imagine? I was like, and I remember thinking to myself, like, I don't want to imagine. Yeah. So at this point in time, we thought that they were alive, and they're, the clock's ticking on the amount of oxygen they have left and stuff, and so we know differently now on what happened, but I couldn't even imagine, what it would be like to be locked in a vessel, in basically a tube, like a Coke bottle,
like to me,
and thrown out to sea, and just hoping, because it's like a needle in a haystack in a lot of ways when stuff like that happens.
Yeah.
And hopefully somebody will find us in how many 90 hours of oxygen, I think is what was if that were the situation, that's what they would have.
Yeah.
So I remember thinking just the idea of that, like I didn't want to go beyond into, can I imagine what that's like? I don't want to. I didn't want to at that time, obviously.
Yeah.
So.
No,
and
it's a terrible, I can't even imagine getting on a submarine.
Right.
Let alone going actually to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah. And then it's real easy to disassociate, I guess is the word I'm looking for, from what was happening to. So I think sometimes when this happens, do you remember your first thought or reaction to it when you found out
that it was missing?
We hadn't talked about this, so
yeah, this is when it was missing.
Yeah, when you first learned about it, that it was missing.
Just first, that sounds awful.
Okay.
That sounds awful.
Right. Yeah. So of course, same with me too. Like that's what I just talked about. And then, as I started dialoguing more about it, I'm like, what is this thing, anyways? This whole exploration thing, and it's like, oh, it's just like basically, you pay $250,000 or something, and you get to go in this vessel,
have your own adventure kind of thing,
right? And down to see the Titanic, And I think I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I think that maybe one of the guys on this submersible is called the Titan. So one of the guys on the Titan, I think, may have been one of the guys that went into space at one point in time as an adventure. Remember. So I want the right to be wrong on that, but. But that did come up, this idea of like people going into space and people going, was it 14,000 feet? Do you remember? 12,000 feet. And so $250,000, is definitely a rich person's adventure.
Sure.
And I think that there was a part of me that wanted to disassociate by going, why are people spending $250,000
on that experience?
To go into the depths of the ocean, to fly into outer space. It seems so, well, and that would be out of this world, but it seems so risky.
Yeah.
Like I'm terrified of the idea of flying into outer space. I mean, without any type of training, like, and so it's like, what, so there's that temptation, I think, but I think it's like an effort to cope.
That's what I think too.
It's like, so we want to, first thing, and I think sometimes we want to like vilify the people involved, instead of realizing like these are human beings. They have every right that we have to take whatever adventures that we want to take.
Right.
I mean, people have died spending way less money doing something still dangerous and very and common, and but then when that happens, we chalk it up to, well, that just happens sometimes.
Right. There's a margin of error. There's a risk.
It's not likely to happen, but it happens, and so I think like that's something that happens too, is we have that temptation to disassociate by vilifying, and then there's then we start looking for people to blame.
That's what the blame game is what I've seen really been playing, and that's the part that's been most upsetting to me, is the blame game. It's already hard, the blame game, unfortunately, especially when this went missing, and even right up until now, I would say, 24-ish hours after we know what happened, there's a time and a place to figure it out, but immediately assessing blame. But it's such a human response, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we do it all the time, right? Someone has a massive heart attack. What's the first thing we ask? Well, were they healthy?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's kind of what I was getting at earlier, is that I do think we have a temptation to want to blame to blame the victim first.
Yeah.
Like I think about that with my kids. It's like, they come in, they got a gusher on their arm or something. Like, what did you do? Like, why were you doing that?
Right.
It's like
okay. What are you doing? Yeah.
Then once you allow yourself, and I think that we've got to work it. We got to get past the blaming the victim part. That's not helpful or appropriate or even accurate. information, or I think it's not an accurate depiction of what happened, anyways.
Right.
But then it's like, okay, well, if I can't blame them, then somebody's got to be to blame.
Right.
Whose fault is this? So now that's what we're seeing a lot right now with the submersive is OceanGate is catching a lot of fire because of a lot of what appears to be negligence in this ride. I don't even know what they call
Vessel trip.
I know. Like this adventure, exploration thing. And I'm not saying there isn't negligence, because
I think that's important to point out, is that asking how did something happen is a very productive question.
Right.
We wouldn't have anything be safe if we didn't look into failures. But I think that what's happening, and why we're kind of talking about it today from kind of two mental health people sitting down, is because it's a very common human response to want to figure out, why did that thing happen so that it doesn't happen to me? Right. And so when someone has a heart attack and the first thing you say is, well, were they healthy? It's so that you can start assessing how much you're not at risk for that same thing happening. Right.
Exactly.
And it's a self-preservation thing that I think is again, in isolation, is a very adaptive thing that we've evolved, right? To say, ooh, if you ate, that thing that was making you sick, I'm not going to do it. But what I think is that it also creates that us and them mentality, and that's what feeds the blame game. And it's just not helpful when you're especially attending to the emotions of this.
Right. So that's where we see a change in tone, right? So back when there was hope, we're all pulling together, hoping, and then when hope is lost, it's it's the beginning stages of grief.
That's right.
Start to set in, and there's a part of us that thinks this is what I believe, that if somebody's to blame, that's going to help this make more sense, and then I will feel better.
Right.
But we don't, and that's what's kind of is ironic the right word about the justice system? We have the justice system, but like if someone is murdered, for example, and the murderer is brought to justice, as we say, and someone might say, justice was served, but then how come I still feel so bad?
Right.
I mean, really, because there's really no justice, because it doesn't bring the person back. Right. It doesn't undo the loss, right? And so I think, but there's a part of us that we want heads to roll. And I think this is going to lead into what we're kind of, just what we're going to talk about, is this whole idea of uncertainty. Okay, so something like a tragedy like this puts uncertainty in our face. Yep. And we don't like to feel that. No. And I think that's a human thing.
Yeah, me too.
So I don't think the poster child of mental health is somebody who embraces uncertainty and walks around every day with not trying to minimize that feeling of uncertainty. I think that's just normal for us to do, or else I think we'd have a really hard time operating. And then I think there are, of course, people that take that to an extreme, and they feel like they have control over things they don't have control over. Right. Maybe that's what happened here a little bit. Maybe not. I don't know. But it's things like, I think that's sometimes when things get overlooked and missed, because it's like the other day. My wife was telling me that she caught our son pretending to swim in the middle of the street during a lightning storm. Right? You know which one this is, right? So, and of course, she, was like, hey, you can't do that. If lightning strikes, you're in trouble. And not by me. And he's like, Mom, that ain't never going to happen.
Sure, right.
Right? And she and I were talking about that, in that whole invincibility type thing that we do as kids. And I was like, we got to do that as grown-ups.
We do.
I mean, I can't think of how many times I've decided not to put my seatbelt on, and the statistics are way more against me for that than they are for my son out there, pretending to swim.
Exposing himself to a lightning strike.
Right. And why? Because in that moment, like, I'm not recognizing that, the reality of that something tragic could happen.
Right.
And I'm not going to be prepared.
Sure.
And so I still think that we do that and we trick ourselves into thinking we're in more control than what we are.
Well, I think that we have to, if there's a continuum of oblivious to obsessive, humans wouldn't do well if we were on closer towards the obsessive side. We have to be more oblivious. We have to, tell ourselves that our seatbelt will always keep us safe, and that our vitamins will keep us from getting disease, right? Those are adaptive things, so they reinforce helping. But the idea that there's always, as I've talked with some of my clients, talked about a margin of error, right? Even if you do everything right, there's still a margin of error that exists. And so just embracing that uncertainty, right?
Right.
That's really scary.
Yeah. And I like I like the continuum that you said, the continuum of being oblivious to being obsessive, right? And so it's like finding that balance. But that reminded me of, do you remember several years ago? So we live in Oklahoma. We're in Tornado Alley of Tornado Alley. And there was a family that did everything right. Everything, if you don't have a storm shelter, and everything that we were taught to do during a tornado, they did everything right. And people still died in that, because there's just certain things you can't control. For, right? And but what that does is it brings the reality of uncertainty. It just sticks it right in our face.
Right. You can't ignore it.
And we don't like it.
No.
I don't like the idea that could have been somebody I knew. I mean, there are 5 families out there, or 4 families in that sense, because one of them was a father-son. But there are 4 families, and then all these extended families, and all these friendships that are like, what are the odds that somebody, one of my people was on that thing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we don't like to think.
No, we don't like to think about it.
That could happen. That could happen to us.
Because it keeps us immobilized.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Unable to act, unable to make decisions, unable to take make any decisions, make any actions.
Yeah, and that's real tempting to go down this road of. And again, I'm not saying that if there truly was negligence and from what's being talked about right now, it might seem like there may have been some. I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be a pursuit of legal action and things like that, because if there was some kind of gross negligence, then that has to be addressed. But we're very quick to really want to figure out whose fault this was, and that's I don't think that what I'm not saying is that we shouldn't do that in a sense. I think it's just very human of us.
Sure.
But I do think it's important for us to recognize that, we can be real quick to dehumanize people.
Right.
And not get because we don't want to dive into their story, because, let's just say that the Ocean Gate CEO, for example, you dive into his story, into his life. Maybe he has a family. Maybe he has children. Maybe he was negligent in some way, but he truly thought he had all his bases covered.
Right.
Maybe there are things that he did that went above and beyond for safety that hasn't been revealed, or we don't know about yet. Maybe he's just one of the nicest men you'd ever meet.
Right.
Maybe he's some kind of philanthropist too, that he has all these charities and helps all. What I mean? It's like right now, it's like I don't even think I can't even picture a face in my mind. But right now, it's like Ocean Gate bad guy.
Yeah.
We want somebody to be a bad guy. And I think we've got to be real careful with
Sure.
that.
Well, I think it's an attempt to kind of skip through some of those parts of grief. We just don't.
Sure.
We don't want to feel shocked. We don't want to feel sad. We'd rather just sit in anger. I mean, anger feels better a little bit than sadness, right?
Sure.
Lots of people try to crack the code and not have to do that, but
Right.
it's. I think what we're trying to introduce is that you really can't skip that, and it's not helpful to. And going to the blame game or making this really complex thing simple isn't really going to be helpful.
Right. Exactly. So we the type of practice that we have where we're working with a lot of individuals and couples that are dealing with some type of betrayal trauma, whether it be sex addiction or infidelity. One of the things we talk about a lot actually is the role of uncertainty. And the way I've always said it, or for a long time have said it, that when this type of tragedy, this type of trauma or event happens, the curtains of certainty are opened, and we're now looking out a window into a world of uncertainty.
Right.
And uncertainty is really the name of the game. And what we don't want to do is to close those curtains as if and try to recreate certainty in our life to the degree that we had it. Is recognizing that uncertainty is the world we live in.
Right.
We are very small. We are very vulnerable in a lot of ways, but that doesn't mean that we can't do things to help generate a feeling of some kind of control in our lives.
Right.
But there is a way to navigate our lives in a world of uncertainty.
Sure, absolutely. And feel okay.
Sure.
Right? It's not about letting go of feeling safe and secure and living in uncertainty where you're scared all the time.
Yeah.
Right? It's actually paradoxical, right? Like the more that you let go and recognize that you can't control everything, the more calm and safe that you feel.
Right.
Right? But a lot of us resist that, and rightfully so. We've been through a trauma and a tragedy, especially one that was forced upon us and not caused by us.
Right.
Pushing that away and the injustice of that is a normal, typical human response. But I think that part of growing up, part of experiencing the suffering of being a human, introduces us to this idea that maybe one of our tasks is to learn to live with uncertainty.
Yeah. So, have you seen Stranger Things?
I have.
I think Stranger Things offers a really good metaphor to that because, if you haven't seen Stranger Things, I apologize for going down a tangent that you might not quite understand. But they discover the kind of the parallel universe that they call the Upside Down, kind of like a darker, demonic place that exists parallel to the world we're in. So in that show, when they enter into the Upside Down, it's like they're here, and then they go, they go in, but then it flips upside down, and they're in this world that looks it's the same world, but it's very different. It's dark. It's the rules are different there. And they have to learn to navigate it in effort to get back
to the other
to where they came from. But the difference is that when they get back to where they came from, it's still not the same.
Yeah,
they don't enter into the same world because they just learned something and went through something that they didn't know before.
Sure.
And so now they're having to operate in this world knowing this other world exists.
Right.
And I think that's, people often talk about, like, I just want things to go back to where they were.
Right.
And I understand that desire because we just want the pain to stop. But typically, if you were able to go back, I guess theoretically, not typically, theoretically, if you were able to go back, I would assume that all roads would lead right back to this tragedy. So I know the things that I've gone through, I don't want to go through again.
Yeah.
And so I think the better path is to try to learn. Really, it's kind of only option other than staying stuck,
Mm-hmm.
is trying to learn how to navigate the uncertainty.
Yeah.
What does that mean now?
Yep.
You know.
Well, and these aren't questions that you just like read one book or recognize it and then you've processed it and it's no longer distressing, right?
Right.
It's an unfolding and probably a persistent part of the path.
Right. There is I will say, like, there is a really good book that that had a heavy influence on even how I approach my practice, and it's a faith-based book called The Sin of Certainty. So he's coming at from it from a faith angle, but as I was like reading it, I was like, this is actually got a lot of good implications for from a secular point of view too. Mm-hmm. And so that'd definitely be one I'd recommend. It's called The Sin of Certainty, but there's I think the answers aren't in a book.
The answers aren't in a book, but I think though similarly that another way of a book is a helpful tool.
Sure, it's a tool.
Even mindfulness, right? Tools, right. Ideas around embracing uncertainty, connecting to the present. Letting go, acknowledging what you can do. Those are all ways that just help us, really keep our brains and bodies connected to what's going on and aware and moving forward without, kind of letting these things change us into ways that we really don't want. We don't want to be bitter. We don't want to be a recluse, right? Right. We really want to figure out a way to manage this and let kind of that stuff process and change us. Yeah. And so I think mindfulness is just a good, model maybe for how we cope with some of this. Right.
Yeah. And speaking of that, being mindful of your emotions. Yep. You get to have all the feelings that come with this. I know that I wouldn't say that my feelings have gone to the point of anger, but I didn't lose a loved one in this tragedy. Right. But frustration, confusion has definitely been there. Sadness is definitely there. This I sometimes want to mention too is something like this just kind of throws you into the world of empathy. Even for people that don't know how to empathize very well, all of a sudden are like, "Oh, this is horrible. Awful. This is awful," right? And so, I do think it's important, in the spirit of being mindful, is being mindful of being careful with the blame, especially blaming the victim. Like I said before, that was kind of the first place that I wanted to go, but I think that's normal. That's where a lot of people want. That's what a lot of people want to do at first. But also, just as the investigation's continuing on, being mindful that the people that created this vessel, this adventure exploration type thing, are also human beings. And so this is just not good on a lot of fronts. But there are definitely some learning. Some things hopefully that they'll learn from this, that if they ever decide to create something like this again, they can do it better and safer. But I think more importantly is like just really reflecting on if it's anger that you're feeling, like what's happened, like why is this doing this to me, like what is it that I'm experiencing, and kind of take a dive within self to try to understand why it is so upsetting to you, or frustrating or confusing, and I think it'll be different for everybody to some degree, but I think a common denominator is going to be the feeling of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think so too. That's why we wanted to talk about it.
Or helplessness, yeah. Exactly, yeah. So we appreciate those of you that watched this, and hope that it was helpful and you got some valuable information out of that. And also too, like if you've gone through a tragedy, you're experiencing some uncertainty of your own, like whether it's through betrayal, some kind of betrayal, or just some other type of tragedy where it feels like your world's been tipped up on its end. Right. Would encourage you to reach out to somebody. There's. Right. Well, I'll make sure to put some links in the description regarding what are they called? The therapist directories. Yeah, directories. For example. where you can find therapists, and then of course if there are any good book links, I'll try to include those too.
That'd
in there.
be helpful. So yeah. Well, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah. Thanks.